January 1, 1863. In the midst of America's bloodiest conflict, President Abraham Lincoln signs a document that will forever alter the nation's trajectory. The Emancipation Proclamation, 2 pages that declared freedom for millions enslaved in Confederate territory. But this was not the triumphant, universal liberation many imagine. It was a calculated wartime measure, born from military desperation, political maneuvering, and the relentless courage of enslaved people themselves who forced the issue through their actions. By the summer of 1862, the Civil War had become a nightmare beyond anyone's predictions. 20 months of combat had produced staggering casualties, thousands dead at Shiloh, the 7 days battles, and Second Bull Run. The Union was losing. Lincoln's government faced international pressure as Britain and France considered recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. The president needed to reframe the war, to transform it from a fight to preserve the Union into a moral crusade that would make European intervention politically impossible. But Lincoln had been reluctant. He feared alienating the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, slave-holding states that remained in the Union. Lose them, and the war was lost. He also worried about Northern Democrats and conservative Republicans who supported the war to save the Union but opposed emancipation. In August 1862, he wrote to newspaper editor Horace Greeley, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." Yet forces beyond Lincoln's control were making slavery's destruction inevitable. From the war's first months, enslaved people had been escaping to Union lines by the thousands. They arrived at Union camps seeking freedom, offering intelligence about Confederate positions, and volunteering to fight. Union generals didn't know what to do with them. Some returned them to slaveholders. Others, like General Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe in Virginia, declared them contraband of war, enemy property that could be confiscated. By 1862, these self-emancipated people had created a crisis that demanded a policy response. Congress passed the first Confiscation Act in 1861, allowing seizure of property used to support the rebellion, including enslaved workers. The Second Confiscation Act in July 1862 went further, freeing slaves owned by Confederate supporters. But these measures were limited and difficult to enforce. The slaves themselves were forcing a revolution that legislation couldn't contain. Lincoln also faced intense pressure from abolitionists and radical Republicans. Frederick Douglass had been demanding emancipation since Fort Sumter, arguing that the war could never be won while slavery remained intact. To fight against slaveholders without fighting against slavery, Douglass wrote, is but a half-hearted business. Radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner pushed Lincoln relentlessly. They understood what the president was slowly accepting, that slavery was the war's cause and had to be its casualty. Military necessity was becoming undeniable. Union armies occupied Confederate territory but couldn't hold it effectively while the slave system remained intact. Enslaved laborers built Confederate fortifications, grew food for rebel armies, and maintained the Southern economy. Every slave who continued working for the Confederacy strengthened the rebellion. Conversely, every slave who escaped weakened it. The arithmetic was simple. Slavery sustained the Confederate war effort and had to be destroyed. In July 1862, Lincoln made his decision. He drafted a preliminary proclamation and presented it to his cabinet. Secretary of State William Seward raised a crucial objection. Issuing it now, after a string of Union defeats, would look like an act of desperation. Wait for a military victory, Seward advised, so it appears as a sign of strength. Lincoln waited. The victory came on September 17, 1862, at Antietam Creek in Maryland. It was the single bloodiest day in American history. 23 000 casualties in 12 hours of combat. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North had been stopped, though not decisively defeated. Bodies lay in piles along the sunken road, later called Bloody Lane. The fighting at the cornfield saw control change hands 15 times. A Union officer later said, "Every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife. It was enough." 5 days later, on September 22, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The document gave the Confederacy 100 days to end their rebellion. If they did not, all slaves in rebel-held territory would be declared, thenceforward and forever free, as of January 1, 1863. It was a warning shot, a final chance for the South to return to the Union with slavery intact. Lincoln knew they would refuse. The reaction was explosive and divided. Abolitionists celebrated, though many noted the proclamation's limitations. It would only apply to Confederate-held areas, places where Lincoln had no power to enforce it. Slavery would continue in the border states and in parts of the Confederacy already under Union control, including all of Tennessee, parts of Louisiana around New Orleans, and counties in Virginia that would soon become West Virginia. Wendell Phillips called it a measure of military necessity rather than moral conviction, but Douglas understood its revolutionary potential. "We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree." The Confederacy responded with fury and defiance. Jefferson Davis called it the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man. Confederate newspapers warned of slave insurrections and race war. Richmond's Daily Dispatch proclaimed it would incite servile rebellion and murder. Southern leaders declared they would never submit to such tyranny, but they would not negotiate. The South would not give up slavery to save the Union. It had seceded to preserve slavery in the first place. Northern Democrats denounced the proclamation as unconstitutional tyranny. They warned it would prolong the war, make reconciliation impossible, and lead to racial mixing. Democratic newspapers published racist cartoons depicting Lincoln as a race traitor. They accused him of transforming a war to save the Union into a war for black equality. In the November 1862 midterm elections, Democrats made significant gains, capitalizing on war weariness and racial anxiety. Lincoln's party lost seats in the House, though Republicans maintained control. In Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, Democrats made particularly strong gains. The political cost was real, and Lincoln knew it. As the 100 days ticked away, Lincoln refined the final version. He consulted with his cabinet throughout December. There was pressure to back down, to modify or delay. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase, despite being an abolitionist, worried about economic disruption. Military officers warned of desertions from border state units. Some advised limiting the proclamation to specific areas or adding compensation for slaveholders. But Lincoln held firm. He had made his decision and would not retreat. On New Year's Eve, Washington's black community held watch night services, praying and singing hymns through the night, waiting for the dawn of freedom. Similar gatherings occurred in churches across the North. Frederick Douglass attended a celebration in Boston's Tremont Temple. The crowd waited anxiously for news from Washington as the hours passed. Would Lincoln really sign? Had he changed his mind? Telegraph lines hummed with anticipation. January 1, 1863. Lincoln spent the morning at the traditional White House New Year's reception, shaking hands with hundreds of visitors for 3 hours. His hand was so swollen and tired that he worried about signing his name clearly. "If my name goes down in history," he said, "it will be for this act." He wanted his signature to be firm and clear, not shaky or uncertain. A trembling signature might be interpreted as uncertainty or weakness. That afternoon, he signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. The document was more specific than the preliminary version. It named the exact states and regions where slavery would be abolished: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana except for specified parishes, and Virginia except for specified counties. It explicitly allowed for black men to serve in the armed forces and navy. This provision would prove as transformative as emancipation itself. News spread by telegraph. At Tremont Temple, Douglas's crowd erupted in celebration when the announcement arrived. A man in the balcony began singing "Blow Ye the Trumpet Blow." The entire audience joined in. They sang, they wept, they shouted. Douglas himself was moved to tears. Similar scenes unfolded in black churches and communities across the North. In contraband camps throughout the occupied South, freed people held celebrations despite the cold winter weather. But the proclamation's real power would be tested in the South, where nearly 4 million people remained enslaved. In Confederate territory, news traveled through whispered networks and grapevine telegraphs. Enslaved people had been monitoring the war's progress closely, gathering information from overheard conversations, newspapers, and Union soldiers. Many already knew freedom was coming before January 1. They had been preparing, planning, and waiting. The proclamation transformed the war's meaning fundamentally. What had been a conflict to preserve the Union became a war of liberation. European powers, particularly Britain with its strong abolitionist movement, could no longer consider supporting the Confederacy without appearing to endorse slavery. British working classes had opposed intervention despite cotton shortages that caused unemployment in textile mills. Lincoln had successfully reframed the conflict in moral terms that resonated internationally. France, which had considered joint intervention with Britain, backed away. Yet the proclamation freed no one immediately. It applied only to areas in rebellion where the federal government couldn't enforce it. Slavery continued legally in the border states. In practice, slaves would only become free as Union armies advanced into Confederate territory. Freedom would have to be won mile by mile, battle by battle. The proclamation was a promise, not an immediate reality. The military impact was immediate and profound. The proclamation authorized the recruitment of black soldiers. By war's end, approximately 180,000 black men would serve in the Union Army, with another 19,000 in the Navy. They constituted roughly 10% of the Union military force. Their contributions would prove decisive in the war's outcome. They served in 449 engagements, including 39 major battles. Black soldiers faced unique dangers. The Confederacy refused to treat them as legitimate soldiers. Jefferson Davis ordered that captured black soldiers and their white officers be executed or enslaved. The threat was real. At Fort Pillow, Tennessee, in April 1864, Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest massacred black soldiers trying to surrender. Witnesses described Confederate soldiers shooting wounded black troops and burying some alive. At the Battle of the Crater near Petersburg, Virginia, Confederate soldiers targeted black troops after the Union assault collapsed, killing many who attempted to surrender. One Confederate officer later wrote, "It seemed to be understood that we would not take Negro prisoners." Despite these dangers, black soldiers served with extraordinary courage and effectiveness. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, led by white officer Robert Goodshaw, became famous for their assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863. Though the attack failed and Shaw was killed, the 54th's bravery helped dispel racist assumptions about black soldiers' fighting abilities. Sergeant William Carney of the 54th became the first black soldier to earn the Medal of Honor. At the Battle of Milliken's Bend in Louisiana in June 1863, black troops fighting their first major engagement successfully repelled Confederate attacks. A Union general reported, "It is impossible for men to show greater gallantry." Black soldiers proved themselves repeatedly in combat. At the Battle of Nashville in December 1864, black regiments helped crush Confederate General John Bell Hood's army. At the Battle of Honey Hill in South Carolina, black troops fought stubbornly despite heavy casualties. Union General James Blunt wrote after watching black soldiers fight at Honey Springs, "I never saw such fighting before." The question that Negroes will fight is settled. Besides, they make better soldiers in every respect than any troops I have ever had under my command. The proclamation accelerated slavery's collapse throughout the South. As Union armies penetrated Confederate territory, enslaved people fled to Union lines in even greater numbers. Plantations lost their labor force. Confederate war production suffered. General William Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas became a liberation march, with thousands of freed people following his army. Sherman initially viewed these refugees as a problem, slowing his advance. But they provided intelligence, served as guides, and worked as laborers. One Union soldier wrote of seeing enslaved people abandon plantations. They left everything and rushed to the army. Old and young, men, women, children, they came by the thousands. The economic impact on the Confederacy was devastating. Cotton production collapsed. Food supplies dwindled as plantation agriculture broke down. The Confederate commissaries struggled to feed armies. Desertion rates among Confederate soldiers increased, partly because soldiers worried about their families surviving without slave labor. The Southern economy, built entirely on slavery, began disintegrating. Lincoln understood the proclamation's limitations from the start. It was a war measure, justified by his authority as commander-in-chief. A future president or court could potentially reverse it. To make emancipation permanent and universal, the Constitution itself had to change. Lincoln threw his political weight behind the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States. He lobbied Congress intensely, trading political favors and applying pressure to secure votes. The amendment passed Congress in January 1865 and was ratified by the states in December 1865, 8 months after Lincoln's assassination. The vote in the House was 119 to 56, barely reaching the required two-thirds majority. Lincoln's political maneuvering had been crucial. When the amendment passed, the House chamber erupted in celebration. Members wept, cheered, and embraced. They understood they had witnessed a historic moment. The Emancipation Proclamation's legacy remains complex and contested. It was not the broad humanitarian gesture many later believed. Lincoln explicitly preserved slavery where he could have ended it, in the border states and occupied Confederate areas. His primary goal remained saving the Union. He said as much in his letter to Greeley. His objective was union, not emancipation. Yet the proclamation fundamentally altered the war and the nation. Once Lincoln declared emancipation a war aim, there could be no compromise peace that preserved slavery. The document also revealed the agency of enslaved people themselves. They did not wait passively for Lincoln to free them. By escaping to Union lines, providing intelligence, and demanding inclusion in the fight, they forced emancipation onto the national agenda. The proclamation acknowledged a revolution already underway, one that enslaved people themselves had begun. Historian W.E.B. Du Bois later called this the general strike of enslaved people, a mass refusal to continue working for the Confederacy. For Lincoln, the proclamation marked a personal evolution. The man who entered the presidency willing to preserve slavery to save the Union emerged as the great emancipator. Whether driven by moral growth, military necessity, or political calculation, likely all three, Lincoln ultimately placed himself on the right side of history's greatest question in American life. He grew into the role history demanded of him. The proclamation's immediate effect was limited. Its ultimate impact was revolutionary. It announced that the United States would no longer tolerate slavery, that black people would fight for their own freedom, and that the war would not end until slavery ended. In doing so, it gave the Civil War meaning beyond mere preservation of the Union. It transformed a political conflict into a struggle for human freedom, connecting America's deadliest war to its founding principles in ways the founders themselves had failed to do. The document that Lincoln worried about signing with a steady hand became the foundation for a new birth of freedom in America.